We're here with Rachel Nichols, host of The Jump on ESPN, longtime reporter, longtime media figure.
Something.
Good to see you again. We
Thank
go
you.
way back.
Yes.
You were an intern, actually, because
Yes.
a lot of people are going to be watching this
College
class.
age, right?
College age, wondering how you got this job. You were an intern at the Chicago Sun-Times, if I remember
was.
when we first met.
Yes.
Way back in the day.
More than 20 years ago.
And you went to Northwestern.
And you just haven't aged. So.
Right, and you too. Okay, and we go from there.
Right.
Okay.
The rest of this is all a lie.
But, okay, so how does someone get to ESPN, not once, but twice?
Right. Well, I always say intern. I mean, it's funny you mentioned that at the beginning. I always say intern, especially when you're in college and you kind of have access to more internships than you do really at any other time. Internships are what got me experience. It's what got me clips. It got me contacts. It let me know whether I really wanted to do this. And that's a big thing because the idea of being on TV talking about sports or being in a newspaper talking about sports, the idea of it is appealing to a lot of people. You know, the reality, it's a lot of work at a lot of crappy hours, and you usually start way at the bottom. And there are people who just decide, you know what, I don't like doing that enough. And better to find that out in college and then switch to something else than do all your prep and then end up at 24 or 25 trying to figure out what you're going to do next. So for all those reasons, I always tell people, I interned the summer before college. I interned every summer when I was in college. I interned in the middle of the year, and that led to stringer jobs that I did with different newspapers. And 2 of my college internships led to both my first and second jobs in this business. So,
And they were with
the Fort Lauderdale Sun-Sentinel, covering the Miami Hurricanes football team, and then with Washington Post.
Now, how did you make the transition then to TV?
So I always did sort of I was in that era where they were starting to put newspaper people on TV. Now it, of course, happens all the time, and because it's so much more common, it's probably harder to transition. But when I was doing it, it was the beginning, but still a little bit rare. So I always did like a little something on the side. So when I worked at the Washington Post, I was the Washington Capitals beat writer, and the paper actually had a contract with the cable station that broadcast all the Washington Capitals games, that their Capitals reporter would come on and talk about the team in every pregame show. So that's, 3-4 times a week, very good training while I was doing my newspaper job to sort of get used to being on TV. And then I started doing some freelancing for ESPN and Outside the Lines, and then got an offer to work here full time, which I started doing.
So when you first started working at ESPN and all of a sudden you're holding up that little flag on the microphone and what kind of reaction did you get a different reaction from athletes and coaches? Did the weight of being ESPN, was that different? Even though Washington Post is a great newspaper,
Right.
a lot of athletes don't necessarily read newspapers, but they usually watch ESPN. What was that? How did that manifest itself?
I think it was different. It wasn't hugely different just because where I was coming from. The Washington Post has such a good reputation. National athletes would sort of look at the Washington Post or the New York Times or the LA Times, the Chicago Tribune, all those, sort of big marquee national papers as, they wanted to sort of look good in those markets too. So I always had a good relationship with athletes on a national scale. It didn't feel like, oh my God, it's so different now that I work for ESPN. I think probably if you're coming from a local TV market to ESPN, probably feels a little bit more different. But yeah, look, it's the television network of record if you work in sports. And I think that as I went over the years and people got used to seeing me on the network, and people would come into sports, I noticed rookies, second-year players, they had been in college watching me. They had been, and so it sort of changed their comfort level with me and the access right off the bat.
So what was when you came to ESPN, you started as a reporter, what was the mandate? What did they want? And was it different than what you were doing as a newspaper reporter?
It was sort of along the same lines, but obviously storytelling is done in a much different way. I think ESPN, one of the strengths of the network here and the reason why it has grown so much is because it did have a newspaper backbone. I mean, Vince Doria, a lot of the people who really were in charge at ESPN for a long time were newspaper people, and their emphasis was about storytelling. Whether you're doing it in the written page or whether you're doing it on TV, even a batch of highlights is a chance to tell a story. Here's what happened at the beginning, here's what happened in the middle, here's what happened in the end. And with the stuff I was working on when I first came to ESPN, which were feature pieces, outside the lines, investigative pieces, that's really storytelling, right? So it was using a lot of the same background I had in newspapers, but doing it visually. And for people who are broadcast students, obviously, you know, you're writing to pictures. It's a different way to write. So learning how to do that as I went was a project, but certainly a lot of fun.
And working with producers, and
Absolutely.
it's not like usually as a reporter, you're pretty much
you're
by
sort
your
of
side.
on an island
Right.
until you turn your thing into your editor. This is a much more collaborative process, which I really liked. I mean, I had spent a decade working in newspapers, and to make that shift when I was 30 years old to come here to ESPN, it was all of a sudden like, oh, this is so fun. I have a little band of people, the cameraman, the sound person, the producer. We go do these projects together, and we collaborate, and we work on them together, and I always really enjoyed that, and I still enjoy that to this day. I have a great crew that we work with on the jump, and like, it's one of the most fun things for me.
So you were at ESPN, then you had a great opportunity at CNN. So now you get a chance to, at CNN, to kind of look at ESPN, not only at the outside, but now as a,
Yes,
now
I
you're
have
the
to, I have to interject. So I went to work for Turner. Umbrella,
okay, right.
Which includes CNN.
But you had your own show.
TNT, TBS, and then of course those were the networks I appeared on regularly. And then they also have like True TV and the Cartoon Network and stuff like that. I never got on the Cartoon Network. That was like 3 years at that company. I never got on the Cartoon Network. The rest of them I did.
But did you have a perspective? Okay, now I'm up against these guys, and what
Sure.
was that like for you to kind of all of a sudden be on the inside, and then you're on the outside looking back in?
Yeah.
And how did that alter your perspective?
So my main two gigs when I worked for Turner was I had the show on CNN, which was the first time I'd had my own show, which was a very different experience for me. I was hosting as opposed to being a reporter. I had a lot of editorial control in that show, so I did a lot more decision making about what we wanted that half hour to be like every week. And CNN also obviously takes a broader look at sports stories. The whole idea was to look at sports stories more from a sort of sports and society angle and from a more general audience angle. And at ESPN, you are dealing with such a hardcore sports fan that even just looking at the way I would treat a story like Ray Rice when that broke versus the way it was treated on ESPN, it's very different because I was coming from a different place and a different network. I also worked every week doing a game of the week for TNT basketball, which is it's even more sports specific than when I worked at ESPN. ESPN, at least, you're working with all sports, NFL, NBA, I was doing baseball. When I was doing the TNT stuff, it was for a hardcore basketball audience watching those Thursday night games. So it was kind of the flip side on the other end and sort of that perspective. Same with TBS baseball when I did the playoffs for them. So it was sort of, if ESPN is in the middle, I sort of learned what it looked like from both sides of the window of the house. And it was an educational experience, and I think helped build sort of information as you go.
And how did that impact when you came back to ESPN?
I think it's always good to work at different places and see how different people do things. So when I was at TNT, for example, I think one of the things people really like about the Thursday night basketball show with Charles Barkley and Ernie and Kenny and all those guys and Shaq is that it's just very free-flowing, right? You kind of don't know what they're going to say. I'll clue you in. They don't know what they're going to say. It's just sort of everybody rides it. It's fun. ESPN, the shows I had been on when I worked here the first time around, tended to be pretty regimented. I mean, they have the rundown on the left side of the screen. Like they have the order that everything's going to go in, and there's a good case to be made. That's good television. I mean, I'm not knocking one versus the other at all. But I like the TNT style, and having worked with that, when I came back to ESPN and we were doing the jump and kind of talking about what kind of show it was going to be. Just like at TNT, look, we have subjects we're going to hit. They have video loaded into the machine. It's not like they get on set every day and just say, I don't know what we're going to talk about. But it is a much looser schedule setup and a much looser environment, and that's sort of the model more that we do on the jump. And I think that if I hadn't worked at TNT and seen sort of the bones and knuckles of how that works and how you can do that without having it be chaos, because that's really the tightrope, right? I wouldn't have been able to do that on the show that I'm on now. So that was a good learning experience for me.
You're a longtime reporter and now host of an NBA show.
Yes.
ESPN has a rights deal with the NBA.
Yes.
ESPN has a rights deal with the NFL.
I've heard that.
You've heard that.
Many billion
So, and
dollars.
you've had to address these perceptions and these issues that you can only go so far because you're partners and there's conflicts.
Right.
I mean, how do you handle those? When people say you guys are you can't do that because they're a rights holder. You're a rights holder with them.
Right.
I mean, what about this perception that is there a way? Can you do your job and still be part of a network that has a deal with a league?
I mean, look, it's a great question. And certainly I worked at a newspaper that had no deal with the NFL. So I know what it's like to not be in that position. All I can do is say my personal experience. You know, when I worked at ESPN the first time around as a reporter, someone who was digging for information, spent 9 years covering the NFL and the NBA, pretty much those two sports. I never had anybody say to me, just ease off of that. We got to check with the league office. Just never, once, ever. So I can only kind of go with that. That never happened. And trust me, we dug into all kinds of stuff. We did investigations. I mean, I worked partly for the E60 and OTL investigative units. I mean, that was a thing. So we did all that stuff. Concussion, all sorts of stuff. When I was at CNN and TNT, that's when I think the most inflammatory period between the media and the NFL was, right? The Ray Rice stuff, Roger Goodell under fire. CNN doesn't have a deal with the NFL. So clearly nobody told me at CNN to stop asking Roger Goodell questions. I can't tell you what would have happened if I was at ESPN during that time because I wasn't, so I don't know.
But let me ask you this, because you were during the Roger Goodell press conference, you pushed the commissioner very hard. You were lauded for asking tough questions in that press conference about Ray Rice. Do you feel, though, that if in the same situation, if you had been at ESPN, that you would have been able to act the same way?
Nobody at ESPN ever told me not to ask a question, ever. That's the only thing I can go back to.
And that's what I've heard, obviously, from a lot of people. But there's always going to be that perception, right? Is that, I mean, you can only do so much about the perception, but I mean, it's something that, again, you just do your
perception about everything, right? I mean, I don't know. I feel like the perception thing is something that.
But ESPN, no, getting back to ESPN, though, there is a mandate to break stories, to break news, and that's what you tried, and you did that. I mean,
it is funny. You know, I would say if the instruction that we do get is break news, come up with new stuff, be first. It's not, obviously be right, be smart, but it's not hold back. So if there's any instruction, it's in the pushing direction as opposed to holding back direction. But I can't say this is how it is no matter what. I can only say what I know, and I've been here for 9 years and then another, almost a year again. So around decade, kind of around there. So hasn't happened to me in 10 years.
What are kind of your favorite stories? What kind of stories stand out for you that you've done and maybe encounters that maybe the average fan doesn't normally get?
I like it when people are going through a change, right? I think that's the most interesting. So whether it's a rookie who's just starting, kind of the guy we're most excited about, or young woman we're most excited about, the person who is finally cresting and winning for the first time, and then, obviously when somebody goes through a struggle, how they're handling that and what they do. So, I've talked about this before, that I've covered LeBron James throughout his entire career. It's probably the athlete I have spent the most time sort of doing intensive interviews with, things like that. I first met him when he was a high school senior, and to watch him go from age 16, 17 to age 31, having a front row seat to any human being's life like that, watching him go from a kid himself to a father of 3, I mean, that's a pretty extraordinary thing in general, and then add in he is one of the best athletes on the planet. That has been great to watch him go through those changes. So I remember very clearly when he was drafted and sitting down with him and kind of talking about that transition from being this high school kid that everybody knew about and was on the cover of Sports Illustrated to now being accountable and having to deliver. That's interesting. The first time he really made a splash in the playoffs and when he was able to break through and make that barrier, that's interesting. Obviously, when he went to Miami, I did an interview with him, Chris Bosh, and Dwayne Wade, sort of right when they arrived, and they had the fire and the crazy lights and all that stuff. So sort of what he was going through in that moment. But then the interview he and I sat down and did about a year later, after he had gone through that rough year in Miami and everyone hated him and sort of they lost in the finals against Dallas in a way that really fell on him. And it's funny, I had the NBA lockout was going on. I kind of touched base with him and his group through that. And it's not a time that's one of those key mark points like rookie or whatever. but it was a time where he was going through a big change. He had gone through this year. He had realized it was not the way he was comfortable playing basketball, and he wanted to change the way he approached the game. And we sat down before the next season started and did a very sort of emotional interview where he said, I don't want to be a villain anymore. He sort of apologized for the first time of how he had handled things, talked about why it was important to him to sort of grow up and get out of the place where he was a kid for college, as he says, go to college in Miami, sort of thing. And that change was fascinating. So those kinds of moments, those are the good moments.
As we close here, we have a number of women in sports media, women students in sports media. They all want to be the next, another Rachel Nichols. What should they know about the landscape that they're getting into today and how it's changed maybe since you got into it 20 years ago?
Yeah, I think it's much better now, which is great and a relief for people trying to do it. But it's still going to be hard. It's going to be hard for anyone. It's a tough, competitive business, so it is going to be difficult. But I think that for women, the important thing to know is you need to trust your own instincts. There is always going to be someone who will have an opinion about what you should be doing, how you should look, what you should think, and that they're going to have, I have found that people have more of those when it comes to women in this business, and that the truth is what you think is really important and what you think is who you're accountable to at the end of the day, and frankly how you're going to be more successful. So if that's kind of your North Star and what you remember, I think that'll be of help.
Great advice. Thank you, Rachel.